Welcome, everyone. As we gather again this morning, we'll seek to follow the same format. We've got quite a bit to cover because I'm going to start us back on page 170. And then we'll break in the middle and then do a second section, hopefully going through the very end of the book, the epilogue and the aftermath by John Lewis himself. I was struck on 170 by the soaring rhetoric that LBJ or his speechwriters came up with around the Voting Rights Act, and then the deep irony of the Democratic Convention that very summer. So that's what we're going to start with. He is speaking about the July Voting Rights Act. Those who are equal before God shall now also be equal in the polling booths, in the classrooms, in the factories, and in hotels, restaurants, movie theaters, and other places that provide service to the public. That is obviously the good work of a speechwriter or LBJ himself to have a sense of momentum, and that hopefully was going to carry the day. This also led once again to the uneasiness of politicians when movement leaders like Lewis didn't want to sit still and just say, oh yes, we'll wait the announcement of this bill. And the contrast that I saw with that in particular, first of all, Lewis was not there in Washington. He was with the Freedom Summer Volunteers in the Mississippi Delta. And as he puts it, they were glad to hear about this, but not joyous. And then there's the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party headed to Atlantic City for the Democratic Convention, hoping to unseat the totally white backroom arranged official delegates. And there's also discussion as we move in, but I really want to point out on 73, if you haven't had a chance, attend with care to the Fannie Lou Hamer story. Someone who just was not going to be held back from voting, even though it was costing her beatings, possible expulsion from the place where she and her husband and family were sharecropping. So that statement to the Credentials Committee in Atlantic City is a stunning piece, and it's in two parts there. It carries into 174.
Jeff?
Yes, Ron.
Fannie Lou Hamer, I have to admit, I didn't know much about before this, but she became my heroine after I read the account, and then did some research and found a documentary produced by Mississippi Public Television. It's only 30 minutes long, but I'll provide the link to that. But when you see it and you see the impact that her words had on the Credentials Committee and the permanent change that it made on the Democratic National Committee selection of delegates going forward, she really was impactful.
Great reference there, Ron. And if it's in chat, that's great. And we will, again this week, I hope, be able to get any of the links in chat then out to you all. So, but I admit I did not know as much either. And I think I've learned more each of the times I've gone back in this book to read her story. So I look forward to getting better acquainted. Ron, thank you. there is, of course, as this develops, and the word was beginning to get used now, white backlash. And it is white, of course, because power is white. And so when there is pressure and incursions from folks who are not white, then there is backlash. I'm stunned again at the echoes in our own day. What I think we're experiencing right now in all the voting restriction laws across predominantly red states is a massive piece of backlash.
Yeah.
And the prior 4 years have been a backlash to the Obama presidency. So it's worth some more serious consideration too. On 178, when in the midst of the Freedom Summer work that Lewis was doing, he got word of the accommodation of white supremacy on the floor of the Democratic Convention. Either Lewis or Meacham used the word odious. And I think the heftiness of that word signals the utter paradox of the soaring rhetoric and then the reality on the ground. On 181, there is some interesting reaction because Lewis was registering, and at first they were pleased to make him the first Black man to be a conscientious objector in Alabama. But then you'll note in that story that when the Selective Service Administration looked at all of his arrests, they changed his classification to 4F. Now, 4F during the Vietnam War was what I had many of my colleagues hoping to get, you know, the bad knee, but in this case, 4F was because they determined he was morally unfit to serve. After going the whole process of declaring his conscience, as someone who went this path, it was, you know, it's not an extensive treatment, but it's an incredibly revealing treatment of Lewis's conviction. And once again, the world does not want to hear his witness. There's an interesting discussion on 185. We're leaping into chapter 6 of what Harvard psychiatrist Robert Coles called battle fatigue for Lewis and other leaders of the civil rights movement. And there's a chance for him to then go to Africa, sort of get a breath. Lewis is stunned to be in countries where Black people are in charge. That was just the way it was. And for him, that was stunning. And then interestingly, he and Malcolm X get to sit down in Africa and compare notes. And Lewis was always deeply appreciative of Malcolm X's leadership, even if on the issue of nonviolence, they were in distinct contrast. Another of the heroines, as you put it, Ron, would be Amelia Boynton, and this is on 188. She was very active, suffered herself, and I believe is the author of that phrase, a voteless people is a hopeless people. Again, underlining that. Coming back from Africa, that did not mean things had changed dramatically for Lewis, but it appears from Meacham's perspective that he took a bit of a respite into likely the most intense part of the movement. Meacham always likes to tuck in these other historical figures. So on 190, we get George Lincoln Rockwell of the American Nazi Party, who decides to descend on the South and fan the flames of hatred. Lewis, as he wrestles, though, on 194, views tribulation as a necessary precursor to the beloved community. In other words, it's not a walk in the park to get to the beloved community. It will be struggle, and from his perspective, nonviolent struggle. Every time I reread this next section, which was the Selma to Montgomery, the first start, and that Sunday where King and some others were back at their churches, and so was Lewis and Hosea Williams. I think Meacham's ability to describe a scene is so powerful. To be coming over a bridge, and then there's that banter about neither of them being very good swimmers, so they're going to have to keep walking. There's no jumping overboard, and it's banter. We all need banter in very serious moments. But to see that sea of blue, all those troopers lined up in front of them, and then to go through that scene, I'm in 196 now. Lewis thought the absolute best thing to do would be to kneel and pray, and they never got a chance to do that because he heard troopers advance. He was the first person who was hit, delivering a cracked skull and concussion to him. And then they started with the tear gas. Fortunately for the desperately needed change in the world, the media was there, as we had media at the time. So that Sunday, which became Bloody Sunday, was then known all over the world. The marchers had to retreat and regather at Brown Chapel where they'd started. And then they were just clustered trying to recover. The image of that as Meacham shares it, is incredibly evocative. I think if you want to put it in our own time, think about the sanctuary and every other available space at Fourth being filled with people who'd been beaten, who were ill. 48 of the marchers were finally taken to the hospital for treatment, and 13, including Lewis, were admitted. I was struck by the scene on 200 about having Lewis strapped to a chair, carried out to a bread truck, because there was room enough to get Lewis in the chair into the bread truck to get him to Good Samaritan Hospital. On 201, the Washington Post got out a blistering account. And then when King arrived on Monday, there was a call for clergy of all faiths to arrive. It's good to have talked to just a limited few who were there that day. I remember conversing with Martin Marty. He is a professor emeritus at the Divinity School, a dear friend of Fourth's, lives across the street in the Hancock building. And his son Micah is our photographer, but he was one of my favorite professors. And he and a few other Lutheran clergy, ELCA, as it was just emerging, had immediately headed for Selma at that call. because there was a deep sense that this was a Kairos moment, a crisis moment in history. I went to high school in a university town and was in high school at the time, but it was Ann Arbor, Michigan. So I had colleagues who went to Selma. I wouldn't have been able to sell that in my household, nor was my consciousness yet there. But to hear some of the stories of how that worked were very important. There, as with Meacham, always interesting little side roads, and I'm not suggesting we take them far, but you have George Wallace with LBJ at the White House and all the political maneuverings. LBJ makes sure Wallace is in a shorter chair and he's in a bigger chair so he can seek to overwhelm him. It's, to me, intriguing, but in the midst of this crisis, and when LBJ addresses Congress on 203, there is clear again the oratory from the Voting Rights Act. He is speaking for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy. So we've got some soaring rhetoric here, but we also have Bloody Sunday and then the efforts to carry on the march from Selma to Montgomery. On 207, I think a key observation, in the end, clubs and horses and tear gas were no match for love and grace and nonviolence, bringing in the beloved community. It was intriguing here that Lewis, who is becoming more and more politically involved, came to the White House, consulted, and I think within almost 24 hours was in jail because they had segregated voting registration lines back in the South. He thought enough of that, and back to jail he went. On 214, again, my appreciation for how Meacham picks up on the intellectual roots of things. The sources of the movement began to shift. It had been biblical texts, Thoreau, Reinhold Niebuhr, Gandhi, and King, and they were now being replaced by Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, and as it began to be worked out, Richard Wright and Black Power. So there is a shift intellectually, there is a big, which we can glimpse, and then a shift in the movement. And 215, we have the assassination of Malcolm X, and Lewis heads to New York City for his friend. And then a bit of a summary statement where I'm going to call a halt to this first section, which is there was an ending of Jim Crow and voting rights, but it was only a beginning, and it was long, long overdue. I'm going to pause and see if we have comments. Things I'm thinking we might discuss is Selma's significance. And if you have memories, if you were, I mean, not necessarily being there, but aware of the event, I think that's very important. It'd be easy to take on a lot of that change in intellectual texts which lay behind excuse me, the movement. And then the tensions we've seen through these pages of politics and direct action. Push, pull, tensions, and where the soaring rhetoric is sometimes paradoxically reversed in the streets. So Ira, I'm happy to throw it back to you. If I think there's been at least one or two comments in chat.
Well, did anyone who put anything in the chat want to expound upon what they said? Claudia?
Claudia?
Yes, I made a couple comments to this effect in chat. I've always been interested in what I think of as a generation gap that occurs in the movement, building before Selma, but after Selma, really young people in the movement, people like Stokely Carmichael, for example, losing patience with their elders' view of nonviolence, passive resistance. John Lewis certainly embodies that. He was very, very young. But I see Selma as sort of a turning point in that trajectory of the movement going a lot of different directions, all aiming to get to the same place, of course. But you have the emergence of the Black Power slogan and ultimately the so-called Black Panther movement. And so there's a tragedy about Selma because I think they were very unified at that point. And then by the time of King's death in 1968, the movement really had kind of fragmented and was just, and King himself was aware of it and began to shift his focus to the war in Vietnam, to the war on poverty, the march on poverty that he was planning when he was killed. Would you agree, Jeff?
Very much so. I think, and there, as Meacham just evokes from us, there are interesting nuances to pick up, but we need to look for the basic patterns.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I stopped here is I stopped right before what we will talk about next, which is the coup that organizationally, that's used metaphorically there, yeah, where John Lewis is unvoted as the head of SNCC. But that path is arriving, and you get it in the Meacham's, I believe, treating Carmichael and Lewis and their differences as they embody the differences in the broader movement. So very much so, Claudia, thank you. Ron and then Charlotte, from my seeing point.
Jeff, as I was reading Meacham's account of Bloody Sunday in Selma, and also thinking about the speech that Fannie Lou Hamer made before the Credentials Committee, had it not been for television cameras capturing that, and LBJ being so nervous about what Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony would do in terms of replacing the Mississippi delegation and the backlash, the white backlash that would result from that, and rushing down to the press room for a hastily called press briefing to announce it was the 9-month anniversary of JFK's assassination. That was all the news he had to divert attention, but it didn't work. But had it not been for the televised reports, and I was thinking even, fast forward to last summer, and the video of George Floyd's death. You know, the media, and particularly video reports of accounts, have changed history.
Very much so. Thank you for that. I think, Charlotte, you were going to.
I just thought it was an interesting aside how the Black Panther term came to be. I thought it was more like an organized movement. It turned out it was an illustration on the ballot for that one party that was formed. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Very much so. It's some symbolic moment suddenly becomes a monolith in our minds as we go back and try and grapple with it. Excellent example, Charlotte. Thank you. Any other comments?
I really like the LBJ and George Wallace conversation where LBJ says, you know, how do you want to be remembered? George Wallace, he hated. You know, it's so, you know, I just love the way Meacham sort of extracts these little dialogues to really put you in the picture.
Yeah.
Yes.
That is kind of how he
Very good example. It's amazing the power of language, and you know, he does it so well. I saw a couple other
I think
hands.
Lorraine maybe.
I just remember
Yes.
during that time, I was part of it's called Circle Church, if anybody heard of it. It met in the Union Hall, and they had begun a ministry or a project in the Austin neighborhood. And we had medical, and then we worked with kids, tutoring. And then we were working, we had lead, but then this Afro-American man, because mostly we're white people, were doing this. And then an Afro-American man was taking on leadership during this Black Power. So he would go around during our class time to make sure we were teaching and not communicating and making relationships with the children. I remember that so well. I thought, oh my goodness, what happened? What is this? And no, he didn't want us to have any relationships. He wanted whatever the knowledge we were given, that is, we're giving to the kids. That was the thing we could do. So that's just a comment that I had, a memory of that time.
Oh yeah, and powerful one, obviously, because it stayed very clearly with you. It is very different to be a well-intended ally or to be someone who lives with this every second of their lives. Powerful. Ira, there are others?
I don't know. Anyone else? Deborah?
Deborah,
Yeah,
yes.
I'd like to make several comments. On page 180, Lewis, there's an important quote from Lewis, I feel, where he's commenting on the seating of the integrated committee. It's the top of the page. It's the third line down middle. As far as I'm concerned, that was the turning point of the civil rights movement. We made our way to the very center of the system. We played by all the rules, and the door was still slammed in our face. And that really struck me as I read. And I have seen a news clip of Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony, not the documentary that Ron is going to share with us. But I was so impressed with her. This was, I can't place exactly when, it was a while ago, or in what context, but very moving. Also, actually, this idea of a Black person's response to being in a Black majority upon visiting Africa is also touched upon by Richard Pryor in one of his HBO specials when he goes to Africa. Excuse me. I think it was in his Man Burning or Man on Fire where he wears the red suit. And finally, I have a quote. We haven't talked about this at this point yet, but I believe it falls within these pages. The murder of James Chaney and the three Mississippi young men whose bodies were found in that dam. I have a quote that I copied and I cherish. I save it. The speaker is James Chaney's either widow or his girlfriend at the time of his death. It's a brief quote, and if I may, I'd like to share it here quickly. All right, these are her words, and I'm heard okay. The audio's okay on all this.
Yes.
Thank you. To the world, James's death is an historical event, even becoming now an historical footnote. But to me, his death is my heart. He was the man my young self loved, whom I planned to marry, to have children with, to grow old with. Those dreams died when he died. They died, of course, for both of us. The smart, courageous, funny, lovable man that I so deeply loved left me and the world in the instant that it took for a bullet to kill him. My James was gone from me and from the world. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Deborah. The tensions here of a broader movement and the incredible impact of repeated violence and death can only be captured in these kinds of specific examples, I think. Any others, Ira, or should I need to push on soon or we won't make the finish line?
Let's push on.
Okay. Around 219, we get the discussion of SNCC deciding that they had fundamentally moved beyond John Lewis. It wasn't specific, but there was a sense that Lewis was spending a good bit of time politically. There's that great anecdote that if LBJ called, they might be in the middle of a demonstration, but Lewis was headed to the dry cleaners to get his suit prepped and head to Washington. That, I think, is another specific example that captures the parting of the ways, which of course, for Lewis, as he says himself, was deeply personal. It was a loss, but it did not deter him in his discipline of nonviolence and his image that Black and white people should be working together, or in these days, for us, a vision of multiracial efforts. There's more treatment of Carmichael and Black Power. King and Lewis are demurring on that. No, we don't meet violence with violence. But when he's leaving the offices, this is on 223 in Atlanta, because that really ends his Atlanta chapter. He felt abandoned, cast out, and very faithfully quotes the psalmist, "How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land?" This becomes Lewis's time of exile. I mean, he heads to New York City because of all the connections and recognition. He's working with a foundation. And Meacham sort of crafts this because his being in New York City gets Lewis to Riverside Church for that major speech of Dr. King addressing Vietnam, the incredible number of Black men dying there, as well as in the United States, and the sense of the seeming paradox of seeking liberty, although I would question the use of that word and what we were seeking in Vietnam, but we were seeking liberty, but ignoring oppression at home. And we get several quick chapters. There's been very little reference to Lewis's wife, Lillian Miles. They meet and fall in love with the help of movement friends, by the way. They weren't using any of the dating apps. They didn't exist. I was intrigued on 226 of how Robert Kennedy captures Lewis's attention. So this becomes sort of his investment in this new phase of his life. On 228, a reference to which we really needed resource last summer, I think, Dr. King's quotation that a riot is the language of the unheard. Now, a riot versus looting, again, distinctions are needed, but for King to realize that no matter how the movement is moving, many people still feel I'm not being heard. And rioting is one response. At King's death, for Lewis, the grief was consuming, paralyzing, unspeakable. At the very end, he said, I'd met this man when I was 15. He had shaped my life more than anyone else, and now he's gone. So a clear sense of their partnership. Then, of course, for Lewis, getting on board with RFK, Bobby Kennedy, being fully part of the campaign and going through that shattering assassination was also just devastating. I want to push us into the epilogue, which Meacham frames very interestingly because Lewis is asked to preach at the National Cathedral in DC 40 years after Dr. King had preached there. And he chose to use the same text from 1 John. And since many of our recent devotions have been in 1 John, and Rocky even did Foundations of Faith class on those letters, the connections abound here. But for Lewis on 234, our responsibility is to create the tabernacle here on earth. Another quite stunning quotation there. We arrived here in this country in different ships, but we are now in the same boat. A lot behind that, of course, an earlier mention, that's sort of the brave, exciting, scared European settlers versus Black Africans in the holds of slave ships. But Lewis reaches back and pulls on that. We do get a sense on 235 that in all of this, despite his involvement in the now more in the political campaigns, Lewis is restless. This the movement has now become diffuse, nuanced. It's political, it's economical issues that dominate. And I think that's very important for us to hear. What for Lewis were shining moments and he, of course, ends up running for Congress versus the more handsome, charismatic Julian Bond. But in what I thought was very interesting, due to the white minority of voters in his district, he ends up beating Bond, and that lands him in the House of Representatives for the rest of his career. Didn't mean Lewis had given up activism. It's just intriguing to note that he was arrested 5 times while in the House of Representatives. And that's on 237, 239. Lewis's reaction to the death of George Floyd. So it makes a very distinct connect. He lived to go to experience that. And I was also intrigued on 239 that there's a sense that for Lewis, Obama got it. So that honoring of Lewis by Obama later, and then the fascinating image from Otis Moss Jr., or the third, that Lewis was the Moses generation and Obama was the Joshua generation, trying to get the people into the land and move things along. Very, very evocative again. That's on 240. On 241, interesting quotation from former President Obama. He hailed Lewis, who led the mighty march. Our job's easier because somebody already got us through that first mile. Somebody already got us over that bridge. When it feels like the road is too hard, when the torch we've been passed feels too heavy, we will remember these early travelers and draw strength from their example. And then the amazing quotation from Isaiah. The contrast is interesting. These are tributes to an amazing leader, but woven in there is that for Lewis, he plods on. It is literally one step in front of the other. He somehow manages to keep moving with all these changes. There are a couple other things, and then we'll get in some comments from the rest of you. Lewis clearly identifies that they were in Selma on Bloody Sunday because of their faith. This wasn't just correlated with their faith. Their deep belief in a God of justice and a God of mercy put them on that bridge. And in Lewis's concluding reflections, 248, fear is abroad in the land, and we must gather the forces of hope and march once more, lest any of us think we're reading history. This is an incitement to action coming directly from Lewis. And further, that now wonderfully quoted reference, there is needed, necessary, good trouble to do. My last comment here, and then we'll open it up, is in the author's acknowledgements. I always find that things get tucked in, so you don't want to ignore those. Just what we've already discovered, this was not a full-scale autobiography, but rather an appreciative account of the major moments of Lewis's life in the movement. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what we were looking for. We certainly got it, but I'm always glad when my conclusions are echoed by the author. So I want to leave it there and see if there are comments from others of you at this point.
Deborah.
I remember I saw a film of, or live coverage of Obama's appearance in Grant Park after his election, where he and Michelle and their two daughters, and Michelle had on the red dress. Grant Park was packed. The camera panned on Lewis, and he was crying. He was fighting back his tears, trying to have not cry, but he was crying in a most quiet, touching way. You know, the visual of the tears rolling down his cheeks. It was very moving to see him.
Powerful image.
Yeah.
I remember glimpsing Grant Park as I was going by in an L train, having watched sort of overlooking the park from friends' apartments. But that night was very transformative. Yes. Ron.
After reading the book, I have an even deeper appreciation for the political savviness of naming the new Voting Rights Act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, especially in light of some of the voter repression things that are happening around the country.
And I think that was not a mistake. And there was a major action yesterday, I believe you called attention to. Are there any comments you want to make out of that virtual gathering?
I watched a little bit of it. There was a nationwide virtual rally yesterday to build up volunteer support for in order to persuade members of Congress to vote in favor of the new Voting Rights Act. There was also a lot of local events, including there was one here in my hometown of Evanston yesterday. I wasn't able to get, and it was a live event. I wasn't able to get to it, but it's notable that these things are happening.
And again, to be having named it for John Lewis and his life of commitment to seek the crucial voting right for every single human being is important to keep in our minds in these days. Other comments? Yes, Louise.
Yeah, for me personally, it's just so wonderful to have these role models, you know, Martin Luther King, John Lewis, because they were steadfast. They never got off the track. It's easy to get off the track. And then if people are against you, right now I've been for the last months working with the White House Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships Group to help people, you know, with COVID and get vaccines. And like, you know, you get into something that's, I think, good trouble. And it's amazing how some people, how you get pushback, you know, like, oh, there's a lot of stupid people. They'll never change their minds about vaccine, you know? So no matter what it is, for me, I think of it, you know, in terms of my ministry. When you feel that this is ministry, that God definitely put you on the path, you know, it's good trouble. You just have to have that razor focus. And you know, at Selma, for example, I mean, my God, you know, their lives were at stake. So it means to me that, you know, we should be brave and try to emulate them. And there's so much faith behind it. You know, you just want to stand on faith. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Deborah.
I would chime in based on Louise's comment the courage of these people is so inspiring. I derive courage, and I have throughout my life, sometimes from the memory of this. I was not too young at the time to participate, and also, Jeff, in my own home, it would not have done well for me to tell my parents that I was going to go off anywhere had I been older. Also, I'm very grateful to be introduced to John Meacham and to this genre of writing. Historical nonfiction is not where I usually go to find reading for myself, but I mentioned to someone who's in one of my CLL classes, I was commenting to her about my experience with John Meacham and his style, and I really was enjoying it. And she said, "Oh, I read him all the time. I read his work on George Bush." And I was like, wow, where have I been? So it's been a very nice experience overall to be in this session, my first time being in a book discussion affiliated with CLL, and also to be introduced to this excellent author. John Lewis was already a person of great interest to me. So, yeah.
Thank you, Deborah. Any other comments?
I just wanted to make sure that everybody knows that John Meacham wrote The Hope of Glory. And he just did that in 2020 because I was surprised, at the content, that kind of content, yeah. Mhm.
Well, and it gives us a clue that he is very involved as an Episcopal lay leader. That's a
Yeah,
devotional reflection on the 7 last words of Christ, but Meacham doing it. And I'm intrigued by it as well. So another place to go. Who knows what he'll be
yeah,
writing next. He does have the responsibilities at the National Cathedral as their sort of historian in residence. And so I did hear the other day that he keeps consulting with President Biden. He's had some influence on
really,
early speeches.
right.
He also helped President Biden figure out the artwork in the Oval Office. So when you're staring at it next time, you just, these are just fun asides, but we're not through with John Meacham. He ends up on Face the Nation in 60 Minutes. So Vanderbilt's very happy, I'm sure, that he's their visiting professor. Claudia.
Well, John Meacham also inspired Joe Biden's expression, soul of, this how does it go? The soul of America.
Soul of America.
Yeah, the battle for our better angels. Yeah, Biden uses that expression all the time.
Well, and that came flowing right out of the book we did almost a year ago now.
Right.
Of that very title. Yeah, I always chuckle as I hear Meacham in and around things we're hearing from our current president. So
He's my favorite.
he's
Meacham
doing
is
good
my
reading.
favorite. He's my favorite current historian, American historian, truly.
Yeah. Anyone else? Yes, Sylvia.
The phrase that I will keep with me from this book and help me feel like a kindred spirit to all of those people in my own little way is that the journey begins with faith, it's sustained by persistence, and it's informed by hope.
Good.
Amen to that.
Yeah.
Amen. Mhm.
Very powerful. Let me offer a brief prayer and then we'll conclude. I am delighted to have had so many of you back and others joining in. It's been a great 3 weeks. Thank you, friends. Let's pray. God of justice and of hope, we give you heartfelt thanks for John Lewis, who one step after the other led people along the way and now leads us all along the way as he dwells within your everlasting realm. May his spirit and his sense of hope and persistence stay with us. May we claim them for ourselves in our own struggles, in our own day. All this we pray through Jesus Christ, our risen Lord. Amen.
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 Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Thank you, Jeff.
folks.
And
Thank
Thank you.